Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about Europe, starting a little before 1200, working our way up to 1450. We'll look at beliefs and practices, religion. We're going to look at the causes and consequences of political decentralization, and then the effects of new agricultural techniques on social organization. That's a nice way of saying rebellions, y'all. So let's dive in. What we know about early medieval society is that kings were weak. They depended on a certain group of people called vassals, and that's a nice way of saying nobles. It's very fancy. These nobles typically held most of the land, and higher end nobles, such as marquises and dukes, actually granted substantial parts of their land to lesser vassals. And that's where you get into your lords and ladies, your sirs, yada, yada, yada. Kings and nobles had limited ability to administer and tax their realms, and a big reason for that was the church. For most medieval people, the manor was their life, and the lord of the manor was their governor. Noble women were pawns in political marriages, but they could own land, and non-noble women worked alongside the men in the fields. Giving some background about the rise of monarchies in England. So the first king would be William of Normandy, and he conquered England in 1066. And with William, we get the system of feudalism. The first time a king's power will actually be limited is in 1215 with King John, who has been vilified throughout history. He's in Robin Hood, he's the bad King John. But King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which was a document that just said Parliament needed to exist. It's made up of the nobles. And the nobles, Parliament, must approve any changes in taxation. The majority of the population, the peasants, merchants, were not represented, and this was not a democratic system in any way, shape, or form. In 1200 CE, most Europeans were peasants. They were bound to the lands in a delightful system called serfdom, and used some rather inefficient agricultural practices. Remember, guys, Europe is still coming out of the Dark Ages. Again, as a friendly reminder, the rest of the world was doing just fine. Europe, not so much. What we see are manors with about 15 to 30 heavily taxed farming peasant families. They support the noble household. Europe's population doubled between 1100 and 1345, and that's because new agricultural practices in Northern Europe slowly spread throughout. And this includes the cultivation of oats, as well as the three-field system. So essentially, two of your fields, you grow crops for consumption. One field, you either let go fallow or you grow oats, which replenish the soil, and they're pretty good for horses. As the population grew, people opened new land for cultivation. But unfortunately, this land had poor soil and rather poor growing conditions. And what happens is the decline in average crop yields dropped beginning around 1250. This is your system of feudalism. At the top, you have your king. And early on, the king really had no power. Later on, we're going to talk about how the king does become more powerful, and eventually we'll discuss absolute monarchs. So at the top, you have the king, and then you have your nobles, knights, and peasants. Kings and nobles gave land, a system fief, to vassals, the nobles, in exchange for military service. Control of this land was hereditary, and vassals gave lands to knights or lower vassals in exchange for military service. The knights were bound by a code of chivalry. And here's another example of the feudal system. The king, the powerful lords, the lesser lords, and the knights, and then everybody else. It's a great system. Peasants were born, they lived, and they died on the manor. Most people never went beyond 10 miles of where they were born. And then the plague hit. So we just mentioned Europe's population doubled between 1100 and 1345, but then on a cold, windy day in October of 1347, a ship from Crimea sailed into Messina, and the crew had a sickness that was clinging to their very bones. Well, what it was is rats had gotten on board, They were carrying fleas, the fleas bit the rats, and when the ship docked, the rats scuttled off. Increased trade helped to spread the plague. And the fact that everybody lived in very close, cramped conditions that were very unsanitary, y'all, there's no plumbing. There's a reason that if you ever have to go to the doctor and they, ask you for a stool sample, that comes from the term night stool. Here's the deal, guys. There was no plumbing in Europe. So what people did is they did their business in a little pot, and if they were wealthier, they had a little stool above the pot. And in the morning, they threw it out the window. They were ridding their house of what was called the night stool. And there you go. A little more history that you probably didn't want to know. 25 million people died over the next several years. That's 1/4 to 1/3 of Europe's population. Within 200 years, though, the population completely rebounded. Remember, guys, Europe's population doubled. This kind of eased the population pressure, if you will. The plague would ravage Europe for 2 years, and then it would return periodically in the 13 and 1400s, causing substantial decreases in the population. Now, here's the thing. What we can at least look at with the Black Death, sometimes in history, we try to look for the silver lining. And here's what happened. As a result of the plague, labor became expensive. It's all about supply and demand. And because the majority of the people who died were the peasants, because they're the ones that are living in the poor, cramped living conditions, this meant that the supply of workers was down, but the demand for labor was up. And thus ended the feudal system, because the lords figured out, if I want to have my land worked, I might have to pay people. And what happens is peasants start getting paid for their labor. We see social rebellions like the Jacquerie in France and Wat Tyler's rebellion in England. That means higher wages, and that meant rural living standards improved. The period for apprenticeship for artisans was reduced, and obviously per capita income is going to rise. And what we'll see is the economy improving. Here you can see the spread of the Black Death. Victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. 13th century European states were ruled by weak monarchs, as we know. 2 changes, however, would undermine the utility and the position of noble knights. And by position, I mean the economic position. These 2 innovations were the armor-piercing crossbow and the development of firearms. And what we're going to see is the power of monarchs beginning to rise. An example of this would be King Philip the Fair, that's him on the screen. He reduced the power of the church, because now we're getting to the point where who's got more power, the monarchs or the church? And that's the bishops and the popes and the cardinals. Well, King Philip the Fair tests that. He reduces the power of the church because he kidnaps the pope and has a new French pope installed in Avignon. Monarchs still face resistance from stronger vassals. And what's going to happen is eventually the Pope is going to be released and reinstated back in Rome, but this incident was referred to as the Great Western Schism. Who is the real Pope? That brings us to the 100 Years' War. So again, we're talking about the rise of monarchs, different monarchs flexing their power. And this was a ridiculous war. France versus England. And this is going to be the beginning of a series of frenemies throughout history. King Edward III claimed the French throne, there you go, in 1337. And the war was fought with new military technology, crossbows, longbows, pikes. Ugh. And that's how you pull a knife off their horse. You do not want to have to... Ugh. If you're a knight, guys, you do not want to get pulled off your horse with a pike. That is not a good way to die. And then firearms, including an improved cannon. But the French, who had superior cannons that destroyed English castles, eventually defeated the English. At one point, they were also led by Joan of Arc, and if you don't know that story, look it up. The war left the French monarchy in a very strong position because they showed the world exactly what they were capable of from a military standpoint. The advent of new military technology, the cannon, and handheld firearms meant that the castle and the knights were becoming outdated. From then on, that's the 15th century onward, monarchs depended on professional standing armies of bowmen, pikemen, musketeers, and artillery units, not knights. And this is the Hundred Years' War. You can see it's a waste of everybody's time. England's in green. Look at the ground they gain. By the time it's over, look at the ground they don't have anymore. They actually lost territory by trying to take over France. Funny how that works out. All right, so we're looking at new monarchies in France and England. The new monarchies that would emerge after the Hundred Years' War had stronger central governments. They were very stable, and they had recognized national boundaries. They also had stronger representative institutions. Both the English and the French monarchs consolidated their control over the nobles. These new monarchs had to find sources of revenue to pay for standing armies, and I apologize because you can now hear my dogs. To raise money, the new monarchs taxed land, merchants, and the church. By the end of the 15th century, there had been a shift in power away from the nobility and the church and toward the monarchs. This process was not complete, and monarchs were still hemmed in by the nobles, the church, and the new parliamentary institutions. The Parliament in England and the Estates General in France. And you got to know the Estates General because they're going to come back later. Spain and Portugal, guys. So this is the Iberian Peninsula. They emerged as strong, centralized states through a process of marriage alliances, mergers, warfare, and what we'll call all of this the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the people who were there, the Moors, which are Spanish Muslims. And if you guys remember from our podcast on Dar es Salaam, we know the Umayyads are on the Iberian Peninsula. They're the ones that built Alhambra. This reconquest, and please picture me doing air quotes when I say that, offered the nobility large landed estates where they could grow rich without having to work because they'll get people to do that for them for free. We call this slave labor. This reconquest took place over a period of several centuries, but it really picked up after Christian Europeans put the Muslims on the defensive with a victory in 1212. So essentially what you see are different Europeans taking back little pieces of the Iberian Peninsula at a time. And we really see this happening in Spain, considering it's larger than Portugal. Portugal became established in 1249. And in 1415, the Portuguese captured a port in Morocco, and that gave them access to trans-Saharan trade. That's going to open up a whole new can of worms that we will get into. Specifically, King João of Portugal and King Afonso of the Congo. We will also later look at the Kingdom of Ethiopia and exactly how they remain independent. On the Iberian Peninsula, we have two major kingdoms, Castile and Aragon. And what you have is Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, that's them. They married, and what they do is they go on this campaign, the Reconquista, in 1492, the same year Columbus sails, and they take Granada, which is where Alhambra is. Spain expelled anyone who was not Catholic or willing to convert. So all the Jews and the Muslims. And if you stay but you don't convert, you must face the fires of the Inquisition. And that's where you get the Spanish Inquisition. What we'll see happening in Europe between 1200 and 1500 are a variety of mechanical devices such as the water wheel and windmills. And mills aren't cheap, guys, but they bring in a lot of profit because they reduce the actual labor of human beings. Industrial enterprises included mining, ironworking, stone quarrying, and tanning. That's making leather from animal hides. The results include greater productivity, but also severe environmental damage, and that includes water pollution and deforestation. It's through this we'll also see trading emerging and the city-state. Specifically, you'll see these in Italy. Increase in trade and manufacturing contributed to the growth of cities after 1200. The relationship among trade, manufacturing, and urbanization is seen by the growth of cities in northern Italy and the urban areas of Flanders and Champagne. What we're going to see is the reopening of trade on the Mediterranean Sea. We'll see a strong relationship between the Venetians and actually the Ottoman Empire. So they trade. Part of the issue, guys, is when we're looking at trade, who's going to have control of the Mediterranean Sea? Italian merchants. And when we talk about them later, the Ottoman Empire. So they forge a partnership. This is going to be the reason why Europe heads across the Atlantic and then heads down into Indian Ocean trade. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The increase in sea trade would bring massive profits as well as the formation of what's called the Hanseatic League in the Baltic and North Seas. Flanders prospered from wool and textiles, while the town of Champagne benefited from their position to major land routes throughout France. We'll also see textile industries developing in England and in Florence. We'll see the rise of the European city-state. European cities offered citizens quite a bit of freedom and social mobility. And a lot of these city-states were actually run by royal charters, and some were run by nobles. Most of Europe's Jewish population lived in cities, and Jews were subject to persecution everywhere throughout Europe except Rome. They were blamed for the Black Death. They were expelled from Spain. Guilds regulated the practice of and access to trades, and women typically were not allowed to join guilds during this time period. If they worked outside the home, it was the food and beverage industry. But the growth in commerce would give rise to powerful bankers like the Medici of Florence and the Fugars of Augsburg. They'll handle financial transactions of merchants, the church, and kings, as well as princes of Europe. Because the Catholic Church prohibited the practice of banking and money lending, because you know how banks stay in business is they give out loans with interest. There was some wiggle room with that. Christian bankers got around this by asking for gifts instead of interest. But because of this, a number of bankers were actually European Jews. Despite these wonderful advances, many cities still lacked basic facilities for ensuring public health and hygiene, like plumbing. What we saw in Rome, what we saw in Islamic cities, what we see in Alhambra, that is not going to exist in Europe for centuries to come. Kiev and Russia. So we're changing gears a little bit. So the Kievan Empire, this is Kievan Rus or Kievan Russia. It is not just Russia. What we need to know is that this area was inhabited by Slavs. These were Vikings that arrived using the river system. The people were called the Rus. Their territory included the Black and Caspian Seas in the south and the Baltic and White Seas in the north. In its early history, Kievan Rus was inhabited by a number of different people. What we're going to see are societies of Western Slav farmers who were ruled by Varangian nobles. Varangians are descendants of Swedish Vikings. And the most important cities were Kiev and Novgorod, both centers of trade. In 980, Vladimir I became the Grand Prince of Kiev, and he chose Orthodox Christianity. He imitated the culture of the Byzantine Empire, he built churches, adopted the Cyrillic alphabet, and oriented his trade toward the Byzantines. What we need to know is that wealth in Kievan Rus was based on trade because they had poor agricultural land and a short growing season, as well as very primitive farming technology. So that meant the power lies in trade. And finally, the Vikings, folks. This is going to be our last topic for today. The age of the Vikings. So here's what we know, guys. In the 9th century, Scandinavians migrated to Iceland and Greenland in search of more fertile land. We know they lived on very small farms. We know women were equal to men. They could own property. They could institute divorce. This is a pretty radical situation, guys. We know the Vikings also liked to plunder. In 793, Vikings sailed to a monastery off the coast of England and destroyed it. stealing all the treasure inside. And in 866, the Vikings would set up long-term raids in London. In the 10th century, the Vikings took over the region of Normandy in northern France. Scandinavians would form war bands around a leader. We also know that the pagan Scandinavian religion involved the worship of many gods, 3 in particular, and their gods were also very warlike. Scandinavians also had the advantage of iron weapons. Between 870 and 930, we know the Vikings went to Iceland. And a couple of reasons happening here. One, Eric the Red was forced to leave Norway, but they also had a pattern of exploration where if a ship was blown off course, it would explore, return home, and then tell people what they found. And then what happens is another group of sailors go and try to find the land. And this is how settlements were established on Greenland. We also know that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led an exploratory voyage in 1000 and ended up in Newfoundland. At the time, it was called Vinland, but Newfoundland, the coast of Canada. We know that women were very active in Scandinavian religion, but we also know, and this is the cool thing, there was trade between the Scandinavians and the Abbasids. Specifically, it's the Varangians, guys. So here you have your Danish Vikings. Here you have your Norwegian Vikings. Here you have the Varangians, the Swedish Vikings. And they're not going by sea, they're going by river. And this is how they're going to end up trading with the Abbasids. We also know there was intermarriage because of this ring found in a noblewoman's coffin, and there is Arabic written on this ring. All right. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, y'all. Cheers.